The bright afternoon sun cast long shadows across Maple Street as Sarah Chen Williams walked home from her high school debate club. At 16, she carried herself with quiet confidence, her backpack full of research materials swaying gently with each step. The neighborhood was peaceful, with its neat lawns and cookie-cutter houses, the kind of suburb where nothing bad was supposed to happen. Sarah checked her phone, seeing a message from her father. "Hope you won the debate. Dinner at 6. She smiled, thinking of how Captain Marcus Williams always made time for family dinner despite his busy schedule at the police department. Her father's position as police captain had always made her feel safe in this town, until today. Officer James Barrett was having a different kind of afternoon. 10 hours into his shift, he was tired and irritable. The call had come in about suspicious activity in the area, a vague description that frustrated him. His canine partner, Rex, sat alert in the back of the patrol car, picking up on his handler's tension. Barrett spotted Sarah walking alone. She wore a hoodie despite the warm weather, her head slightly down as she texted on her phone. Something about her presence there didn't sit right with him, though he couldn't explain why. The officer hadn't seen her in this neighborhood before, and these days, he thought, you couldn't be too careful. He slowed his patrol car, watching as Sarah turned onto Cedar Lane, without running her description against the suspicious person report, without calling for backup, without even attempting to speak with her. Barrett made a decision that would change many lives. He stopped his car. "Stay where you are," he shouted through his window, startling Sarah so badly she dropped her phone. Sarah froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She'd been raised to know how to act around law enforcement. Her father had taught her well. "Officer," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I live just down the—" But Barrett wasn't listening. He had already stepped out of his car and opened the back door. "Get on the ground," he ordered, though Sarah had made no threatening moves. Confused and terrified, Sarah remained standing, her hands raised. "Please, I'm just walking home. My father is." The next few seconds seemed to move in slow motion. Barrett gave the command to his canine unit. Rex, trained to respond to threats, bounded forward. Sarah saw the dog coming and turned to run, a natural but tragic instinct. Mrs. Henderson, watering her roses next door, screamed as she witnessed the scene unfolding. Her security camera captured everything: the officer's aggressive approach, Sarah's raised hands, the unnecessary escalation, and the horrible moments that followed. The dog caught Sarah's leg, bringing her down hard on the sidewalk. Her scream echoed through the quiet street, bringing neighbors to their windows and doors. Barrett moved forward slowly, seemingly frozen by the reality of what he had just caused. Sarah's phone, lying face up on the ground, still showed her father's message. As she lay there, crying in pain and fear, she could only think of him. How many times he had warned her about situations like this, how he had fought to change things from within the system, how he had hoped his position would somehow protect his family from exactly this kind of incident. Mrs. Henderson was already on her phone, but she wasn't calling 911. She was calling Captain Williams directly. She'd known the family for years. "Marcus," she said, her voice shaking, "get here now. It's Sarah, one of your officers." "Oh God, Marcus, hurry." Other neighbors approached cautiously, phones recording. Barrett finally called for medical assistance, his voice lacking the authority it had held just minutes before. As he looked down at the crying teenager, as he heard the neighbors saying her name, Sarah Williams, a cold realization began to dawn. He knew Captain Williams had a daughter. He'd seen her picture on his desk, but he'd never made the connection, never thought. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Barrett stood by his patrol car, watching as neighbors comforted Sarah, as the video evidence of his actions spread from phone to phone, as his career and everything he thought he knew about himself began to crumble. The sun still shone brightly on Maple Street, but nothing would ever look the same again. The emergency room at Mercy General Hospital buzzed with unusual tension. Captain Marcus Williams burst through the sliding doors, still in his police uniform, his face etched with an expression few had ever seen on the typically composed police captain. His wife Claire, who had arrived minutes earlier, met him at the entrance. "Where is she?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Room 115. The doctor is with her now," Claire replied, her hand gripping her husband's arm. As a civil rights attorney, she had handled countless cases of police misconduct, but never had she imagined her own daughter would become one of her statistics. Outside Sarah's room, two worlds collided. Several police officers, responding to reports of an officer-involved incident, stood awkwardly in the hallway. They hadn't yet learned that the victim was their captain's daughter. On the other side, Mrs. Henderson and three other neighbors who had witnessed the incident waited, still recording everything on their phones. The doctor emerged from Sarah's room, clipboard in hand. "Captain Williams," she called, though she already knew who he was. Everyone in the hospital had been warned about the situation. "Your daughter has multiple puncture wounds on her left leg and a sprained wrist from the fall. We're giving her antibiotics to prevent infection, and she'll need some stitches." Marcus nodded stiffly, his police training helping him process the information professionally even as his heart raged. That's when Officer Barrett chose the worst possible moment to arrive. The young officer stepped off the elevator, intending to follow procedure by checking on the suspect's condition. He froze when he saw his captain standing there. The color drained from his face as the full reality of his actions crashed down upon him. "Captain, I didn't know," Barrett stammered, taking a step backward. Marcus turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Barrett. The hallway fell silent. Even the usual hospital noises seemed to fade away. Claire quickly stepped between them, knowing her husband's character, but also understanding the depth of his pain. "Marcus," she whispered, "Sarah needs you right now. Not the captain, not the officer, just her father." Inside the room, Sarah lay on the hospital bed, her leg bandaged and elevated. Her debate team clothes were torn and dirty, and dry tears stained her cheeks. When her parents entered, she tried to sit up but winced in pain. "Daddy," she said, her voice small, like when she was little, and would run to him after a nightmare. But this nightmare had happened in broad daylight, and her father's badge hadn't protected her. Marcus moved to her side, gently taking her hand. Claire sat on the other side of the bed, smoothing Sarah's hair back from her forehead. For a moment, they were silent, the beeping of hospital machines marking time. "I did everything you taught me," Sarah finally said, fresh tears rolling down her cheeks. "I didn't run at first. I kept my hands where he could see them. I tried to tell them about you, but he didn't even let me speak." Outside the room, the situation was escalating. News vans had begun arriving at the hospital. Officers from neighboring precincts were showing up, drawn by word of the incident. Barrett stood alone near the elevator, neither his fellow officers nor the witnessing neighbors willing to stand near him. Chief Thompson arrived next, having been notified of the situation. He found himself facing a nightmare scenario, a racist incident involving one of his officers, the victim being another officer's child, and the whole thing caught on camera. "We need to get ahead of this," he told his assistant, not realizing Claire could hear him from the doorway of Sarah's room. She stepped out, her attorney persona taking over. "No, Chief Thompson, you need to do what's right. Not what's politically expedient. Not what protects the department. What's right?" The chief looked past her to where Marcus sat with their daughter, saw the barely contained fury in his captain's rigid posture, noticed the phones still recording everything. He knew this case would be different. The thin blue line had finally intersected with itself, and something had to break. Inside the room, Sarah gripped her father's hand tighter. "What happens now?" she asked. Marcus looked at his daughter, then at his wife, then through the window at his fellow officers. After 20 years on the force, he had finally reached the moment where he had to choose between the two things he loved most, his family and his badge. "Now," he said quietly, "we make sure this never happens to anyone else's daughter." 3 days after the incident, Captain Marcus Williams sat in his home office, staring at his badge on the desk. The morning sun reflected off its surface, but the shine didn't feel the same anymore. Downstairs, he could hear Sarah crying out in her sleep, another nightmare. Claire rushed to their daughter's room, as she had done every night since the incident. The sound of soft murmuring floated up the stairs as she comforted Sarah. Marcus gripped the edge of his desk, torn between his roles as a father and a police captain. His phone buzzed again, the 15th call from the department this morning. Chief Thompson wanted him to attend an emergency meeting about handling the situation. Marcus had ignored every call. Instead, he opened his laptop and played Mrs. Henderson's security camera footage again. Each time he watched it, his anger grew stronger. You need to eat something, Claire said from the doorway, making him jump. She carried a cup of coffee and some toast. Sarah's finally back to sleep. How bad was it this time? Marcus asked, closing the laptop. She dreamed she was back on that sidewalk, but this time you were there in your uniform, just watching. Claire set down the coffee harder than necessary. The department's lawyer left 3 messages on my office phone. They want to discuss options. Marcus stood up and walked to the window. Outside, 2 news vans still waited at the end of their driveway. Since the video had gone viral, their peaceful suburban life had turned into a media circus. Some reporters painted Sarah as an innocent victim, others tried to justify Barrett's actions, and a few even questioned Marcus's ability to serve as captain given his personal bias in the situation. They want me to smooth things over, Marcus said quietly. 20 years on the force, Claire. I've seen things like this happen before. I've even helped manage the department's response. But now, he trailed off, his voice thick with emotion. Now it's your baby girl, Claire finished for him. As a civil rights attorney, she had always struggled with her husband's role in a system she often fought against. Marcus, you have to decide. Are you going to handle this as Captain Williams or as Sarah's father? Because you can't do both. Their conversation was interrupted by the doorbell. Through the window, Marcus saw Officer Ramirez, one of his most trusted deputies, standing on the porch. He nodded to Claire and went downstairs to answer the door. Captain, Ramirez said, looking uncomfortable. I know you're not taking calls, but you need to know what's happening at the station. She glanced around before continuing. Barrett's union rep is building a defense. They're going to say he followed procedure, that Sarah's actions justified the response. Marcus felt his hand tighten on the doorframe. What actions? Running away from a dog that was attacking her. They're pulling surveillance footage from other houses in the area, trying to build a case that her presence in the neighborhood was suspicious. Ramirez looked disgusted. Some officers are backing Barrett. They're saying if we don't support our own, the whole system falls apart. The system needs to fall apart. Sarah's voice came from the top of the stairs. She stood there in her pajamas, leg bandaged, eyes red from crying. Dad, you always said the department was like family. Well, your family set a dog on your daughter. Claire appeared behind Sarah, wrapping a protective arm around her. Marcus looked between his police badge on the side table and his family on the stairs. The choice that had seemed so difficult suddenly became crystal clear. Ramirez, he said, his voice taking on the firm tone he used at the station, go back and tell them Captain Williams will be at the department in 1 hour. Not to smooth things over, not to protect the department's image, but to demand real change. He turned to his family. Sarah, would you be willing to tell your story? Not just to the media, but to the department? Every officer needs to see what their actions can do to an innocent person. Sarah descended the stairs slowly, limping slightly. She looked at her father's badge, then back at him. Will they even listen? They'll listen, Claire said firmly, because we're not giving them a choice. Your father knows where all the bodies are buried, metaphorically speaking. And I know how to use the law to force change. Marcus hugged his daughter carefully, mindful of her injuries. The department keeps talking about protecting their own, he said. Well, it's time they learned that protecting their own should mean protecting everyone in this community, not just the ones in uniform. The police department's conference room felt smaller than usual as Chief Thompson faced the gathered senior officers. Captain Marcus Williams sat directly across from him, his presence making everyone uncomfortable. The department's lawyer, Susan Martinez, stood at the front of the room, clicking through a PowerPoint presentation titled Incident Response Protocol. As per standard procedure, Martinez said, Officer Barrett has been placed on paid administrative leave pending investigation. She paused, glancing nervously at Marcus. The department's official statement emphasizes our commitment to thorough review of all procedures. Thorough review. Marcus's voice cut through the room like ice. The video shows everything. What exactly needs reviewing? Chief Thompson cleared his throat. Marcus, perhaps you should step back from this case, given your personal involvement. Before Marcus could respond, the door opened and Claire Williams walked in, carrying a thick folder. As both a civil rights attorney and the victim's mother, her presence changed the energy in the room instantly. Actually, Claire said, setting her folder down, my husband isn't stepping back. And here's why. She began distributing documents to everyone present. These are 17 similar incidents in our department over the past 5 years. Excessive force, racial profiling, improper K-9 deployment. All quietly handled with paid leave and internal reviews that went nowhere. The room erupted in murmurs. Chief Thompson's face reddened. "Mrs. Williams, this is a closed meeting." "Not anymore," she interrupted. "When you made this about my daughter, you lost the luxury of handling things behind closed doors." Outside the conference room, local news crews had gathered. Someone inside the department had leaked that a major meeting was taking place. Officer Barrett sat in his car across the street, watching reporters set up their cameras. His phone buzzed with another message from his union representative: "Say nothing to anyone." Back inside, Martinez was trying to regain control of the narrative. "We understand this is an emotional situation, but we need to follow established protocols." "Like the protocols Officer Barrett followed with my daughter?" Marcus stood up, his chair scraping loudly. "Let me read you his incident report." He writes that he observed a suspicious individual who failed to comply with verbal commands. What he doesn't write is that those commands came after he'd already decided to release his dog. He pulled out his phone and played Mrs. Henderson's security footage on the room's large screen. The officers watched in silence as the scene unfolded. Some looked away when Sarah's screams filled the room. "This isn't just about Sarah," Claire said into the silence that followed. "This is about every person who looks like her, who doesn't have a police captain for a father or a civil rights attorney for a mother. This is about a system that automatically assumes guilt based on skin color." Chief Thompson tried one last time to maintain control. "We all want justice. We have to think about the department's reputation." "The department's reputation?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "My daughter has nightmares every night. She jumps at every loud noise. She used to want to be a police officer like her dad. Now she can barely look at my uniform without shaking." He walked to the front of the room, facing his fellow officers. "I've spent 20 years protecting this department's reputation. I've written the kind of reports that make bad incidents sound justified. I've advised officers how to phrase things to avoid liability. That ends today." Claire opened her folder again. "We're filing a formal civil rights lawsuit, not just for Sarah, but as a class action on behalf of every victim of police misconduct in this department. We're demanding not just accountability for Officer Barrett, but complete reform of training, procedures, and oversight." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Everyone knew that Marcus knew where every skeleton was buried, every incident that had been covered up, every officer who had been protected instead of disciplined. Chief Thompson slumped in his chair, suddenly looking older. "What do you want?" "Everything," Marcus replied. "New training protocols, external oversight, body camera reviews by civilian committees, psychological evaluations for all officers, reform of K-9 deployment policies, and Officer Barrett's immediate termination. If you do this," Martinez warned, "it could tear the department apart." Marcus looked at the frozen video frame showing his daughter on the ground, then back at his colleagues. "Maybe it needs to be torn apart so we can rebuild it the right way." The high school auditorium buzzed with tension as hundreds of community members packed the emergency town hall meeting. Signs reading "Justice for Sarah" and "Reform the Police" dotted the crowd. Sarah Chen Williams sat in the front row between her parents, her bandaged leg propped on a chair. Principal Rodriguez had called the meeting after student protests erupted at the high school. Over half the student body had walked out of classes the day before, led by Sarah's debate team members. Now, those same students filled the left side of the auditorium, wearing black armbands with yellow K-9 crossing symbols. "This isn't just about me anymore," Sarah whispered to her mother as more people filed in. She recognized faces from her neighborhood, her school, and even some officers in plain clothes who had worked with her father. Reverend Jackson, a longtime civil rights activist in the community, approached the podium. "We're here tonight because what happened to Sarah Williams could have happened to any of our children. But we're also here because, for the first time, we have a real chance to make changes." In the back of the room, Officer Maria Ramirez stood with a group of fellow officers, all of them people of color. They had formed a new group called Officers for Change after Sarah's incident. Many of them had their own stories of witnessing prejudice within the force, but had felt powerless to speak up. For too long, we've stayed quiet, Ramirez said when it was her turn to speak. We took our paychecks and looked the other way, but seeing Sarah on that ground, that could have been my daughter. That could have been any of our children. The room erupted in applause. More officers began standing up, joining Ramirez's group at the back. The thin blue line was starting to show cracks. Sarah's debate team captain, Jason Chen, took the podium next. Yesterday, we walked out of school. Today, we're announcing a new youth organization, Students Against Police Brutality. Sarah will be our first honorary member. We want everyone to join, especially the children of police officers. We need to bridge these gaps. In her seat, Sarah gripped her father's hand. Marcus squeezed back, proud of how his daughter's trauma was becoming a catalyst for change. Claire was already taking notes, seeing how the students' involvement could strengthen their legal case. Mrs. Henderson stepped up next, her tablet in hand. I've lived on Maple Street for 30 years, she said, her voice shaking. I baked cookies for the police bake sale. I've hosted neighborhood watch meetings. But what I saw that day, she played the video again, and even though everyone had seen it dozens of times, the auditorium fell silent at Sarah's screams. This isn't about hating the police, Mrs. Henderson continued. This is about loving our community enough to demand better from those who serve it. The meeting lasted for hours. Teachers spoke about how their students of color lived in fear. Off-duty officers shared stories of witnessing racism within the force. Parents talked about the talk they had to give their children about police encounters. Near the end, Sarah stood up slowly, using her crutches. The room fell silent as she made her way to the podium. Her father started to rise to help her, but Claire held him back. This was Sarah's moment. A week ago, Sarah began, her voice steady despite her nervousness. I was just a regular kid walking home from debate practice. Now I'm a hashtag, a news story, a symbol. But I don't want to be just a symbol of what's wrong. I want to be part of making things right. She looked at her father, then at Officer Ramirez and her group. My dad taught me that being a police officer means protecting people, all people, so I'm asking every officer here, who are you protecting when you stay silent? Who are you serving when you defend wrong actions? The audience rose in a standing ovation. Even some of the more resistant officers found themselves standing. Principal Rodriguez had to wipe tears from her eyes before announcing the formation of a new community oversight committee. As the meeting ended, people lined up to sign up for various action committees. The students gathered around Sarah, planning their next moves. Officer Ramirez's group grew larger as more officers joined them. Outside, the setting sun cast long shadows across the school parking lot. But unlike the shadows on that fateful afternoon on Maple Street, these shadows were being chased away by the light of change. Officer James Barrett sat alone in his living room, surrounded by empty coffee cups and newspapers. The TV played quietly in the background. Another news report about Sarah Williams. His once-neat home had fallen into disarray over the past 2 weeks, much like his life. The doorbell rang. Barrett ignored it, just as he'd been ignoring his phone. But then his union representative's voice called through the door. James, open up. We need to talk. Barrett reluctantly opened the door to find not just his union rep, Michael Torres, but also the department's internal affairs investigator, Detective Lisa Chen. Their faces told him this wasn't going to be a friendly visit. We've reviewed your body camera footage, Detective Chen said as they sat down. She placed a laptop on Barrett's cluttered coffee table. Not just from that day, but from your last 6 months of patrols. Barrett's stomach tightened. He had forgotten about all those other recordings, all those casual comments and questionable stops he'd made. Torres shifted uncomfortably beside him. James, Torres said quietly, we can't defend this. The pattern is clear. Detective Chen pressed play. The screen showed dozens of clips. Barrett approaching people of color more aggressively than white civilians, making racist comments to his partner, using his K-9 unit to intimidate rather than protect. 15 complaints in 5 years, Detective Chen read from her file. All dismissed, all buried, until now. Barrett stared at his hands. I was just doing my job, following my training. No, Torres interrupted sharply. Don't try that. I've seen the training manuals. Nowhere does it say to release your dog on an unarmed teenager without warning. On the TV, Sarah Williams was speaking at a press conference, her voice strong despite her crutches. Officer Barrett didn't see me as a person that day. He didn't see a debate team member, an honor student, or even just a kid walking home. He saw a threat because that's what he wanted to see. Detective Chen closed her laptop. The department is terminating you, effective immediately. But that's just the beginning. Captain Williams and his wife are filing a civil rights lawsuit. The FBI is opening an investigation into your past incidents. My pension, Barrett started to say. Your pension? Torres stood up, disgust clear on his face. A 16-year-old girl can barely walk past a dog now without having panic attacks. She has nightmares every night. And you're worried about your pension? Barrett's canine partner, Rex, whined from his kennel in the corner. The dog was being reassigned to a new handler, another piece of Barrett's life being stripped away. I never meant, Barrett began but stopped. What hadn't he meant? To show his true colors? To get caught? To have his victim be someone who could fight back? Detective Chen handed him a thick envelope. These are your termination papers. There's also a subpoena for the federal investigation and papers for the civil suit. I suggest you get a good lawyer. As they stood to leave, Barrett found his voice. What am I supposed to do now? Take responsibility, Chen replied firmly. Stop hiding behind excuses. The system protected you for years, but that protection is gone. Captain Williams made sure of that. After they left, Barrett walked to his bedroom and looked at himself in the mirror. His police uniform hung nearby, still pressed and ready for duty. But the man in the mirror didn't look like a police officer anymore. He saw what everyone else now saw, someone who had abused his power, someone who had let his prejudices guide his actions. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. Saw Sarah Williams on TV again. Is that really how I raised you? Barrett sank onto his bed, the weight of his actions finally hitting him fully. He thought about his own childhood dreams of being a police officer, about wanting to protect and serve. Somewhere along the way, he had become exactly what he'd once wanted to fight against. On his bedside table, a photo showed his police academy graduation. He had been smiling, full of hope and purpose. Beside it lay the newspaper with Sarah Williams' school photo, another young person full of hope, whose trust in the system he had shattered in just a few terrible minutes. Barrett picked up his phone and, for the first time since the incident, dialed Captain Williams' number. He knew he would probably never wear a badge again, but maybe he could still do one right thing, tell the truth about everything he'd done wrong. The police department's main training room looked different now. Where once there had been only procedural posters and regulation notices, new signs covered the walls. Check your bias, and protect and serve all. Captain Marcus Williams stood at the front, facing 30 officers, the first group to undergo the department's completely revamped training program. Today, Marcus announced, you'll hear from someone who knows exactly what it means when we fail our community. He turned to the door and nodded. Sarah walked in, no longer needing crutches but still moving with a slight limp. The officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the usual police training session with dry presentations and routine drills. My name is Sarah Chen Williams, she began, her voice steady. 3 months ago, one of your fellow officers set his dog on me without warning, without cause, without humanity. Today, I'm here to help make sure that never happens to anyone else. In the back of the room, Claire sat with the newly formed Civilian Oversight Committee. The committee included Mrs. Henderson, Reverend Jackson, and representatives from various community groups. They watched as Sarah shared her story, not just about the attack, but about how it had changed her view of police officers. Before that day, Sarah continued, I thought having a police captain for a father meant I was safe. Now I understand that safety shouldn't depend on who your parents are or what they do. It should be a right for everyone. Officer Ramirez stepped forward next. Her Officers for Change group had grown to include nearly half the department. She held up the new K9 unit guidelines that she had helped develop. No more using dogs as weapons against unarmed civilians, she explained. K9 units will only be deployed with clear supervision and recording. Every incident will be reviewed by both the department and the civilian committee. The changes didn't stop there. Chief Thompson, who had initially resisted reform, now stood to outline the other new policies. Mandatory body cameras that cannot be turned off during any civilian interaction. Weekly bias training. monthly community feedback sessions, a complete overhaul of our use of force protocols, and most importantly, a zero-tolerance policy for racist behavior or excessive force. Some of the older officers grumbled about the changes. One raised his hand. Isn't this going to make our jobs harder? More dangerous? No, Marcus replied firmly. It's going to make us better at our real job, protecting and serving everyone equally. The old way of doing things? That's what was dangerous. Ask Sarah. Ask any of the other victims who've come forward since her incident. Claire stepped forward with a stack of papers. We've documented 47 cases similar to Sarah's in our department alone. Each one represents a person whose trust we betrayed, whose rights we violated. But today, we're not here to dwell on past failures. We're here to build something new. The training session continued with role-playing exercises. Officers had to navigate scenarios from different perspectives. They watched body camera footage from controversial incidents and discussed better approaches. Community members came in to share their experiences with police. At lunch break, Sarah sat with a group of rookie officers. They were closer to her age than the veterans, and many had joined the force with genuine desires to help their communities. I don't hate police officers, she told them. I hate the system that turns good people into threats to their own community. That's what we're trying to fix. In his office later that day, Marcus reviewed the new recruitment policies with Claire and the Oversight Committee. They had completely redesigned the screening process, adding psychological evaluations for racial bias and extensive background checks for past misconduct. Officer Barrett's federal trial starts next week, Claire reminded them. His testimony about departmental cover-ups will help push through similar reforms in other cities. Marcus nodded, looking at the photo on his desk, a new one, taken at the first community police barbecue after the incident. In it, Sarah stood surrounded by Officer Ramirez's group, all of them wearing Change Starts Here t-shirts. We're not just changing policies, Marcus said. We're changing the culture. It's slower, harder work, but it's the only way to make real difference. Outside his office, the sounds of afternoon training continued. New voices, new approaches, new hope. The department would never be the same again, and that was exactly the point. 1 year after the incident, Sarah Chen Williams stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., addressing a national conference on police reform. The audience included police chiefs, civil rights leaders, and lawmakers from across the country. In the front row, Marcus and Claire watched their daughter with pride. Change doesn't happen in grand moments, Sarah said, her voice carrying through the packed hall. It happens in small choices, in daily decisions, in the courage to speak up when something is wrong. Her slight limp was barely noticeable now as she moved across the stage, but it served as a permanent reminder of why she was there. Back in their hometown, things had changed dramatically. Officer Barrett had served as a key witness in federal investigations, his testimony helping to expose similar problems in departments nationwide. He now worked at a community center, teaching young people about the dangers of unchecked power and prejudice. The local police department had become a national model for reform. Officer Ramirez, now promoted to Captain Ramirez, led the training division. Every new recruit spent their first week learning from community members, including regular sessions with Sarah and other victims of police misconduct. Mrs. Henderson's security camera footage had become required viewing in police academies across the country. But more importantly, her neighborhood had transformed. The weekly community police meetings she hosted in her garden had grown into a movement. Officers and residents worked together on local projects, their children played together at park events, and the invisible walls of mistrust slowly crumbled. My father taught me that a badge is a symbol of service, Sarah continued in her speech. But symbols mean nothing without actions behind them. Today, I'm proud to announce the National Youth Police Alliance, a program that will bring together young people and law enforcement in every state. Marcus smiled, remembering how far they'd come. His department now had the highest community approval rating in the state. Complaints of racial bias had dropped by 80%. The K-9 unit operated under strict new guidelines, and their dogs were more often seen at school demonstrations and community events than on patrol. Claire had expanded her law practice to focus exclusively on police reform cases, working with departments that wanted to change before they were forced by tragedy. She trained lawyers across the country to work with both police departments and community groups, building bridges instead of just filing lawsuits. After her speech, Sarah met with a group of teenage activists. The hardest part, she told them, is keeping the momentum going when the cameras leave and the headlines fade. Real change happens in quiet moments, in daily choices, in refusing to let fear win. That evening, at a small dinner celebration, Marcus raised his glass. "To my daughter," he said, "who turned pain into purpose, and to everyone who helped make change possible." Sarah looked around the table, at Captain Ramirez, who had risked her career to stand up for what was right, at Mrs. Henderson, who had become like a second grandmother to her, at the young officers who now saw her story as a turning point in their careers, and at her parents, who had fought for justice while helping her heal. "You know what's funny?" Sarah said. "I used to think that terrible day was the end of something. Now I know it was just the beginning." Later that night, walking back to their hotel, Sarah and her parents passed a police officer with a K9 unit. A year ago, such an encounter would have triggered panic. Now, Sarah stopped to chat with the officer, even petting the dog while its handler explained the new training protocols they used. "Ready for your first day teaching at the academy next week?" Marcus asked as they walked on. Sarah nodded. "Those cadets need to understand that the power they're given comes with responsibility, that every person they encounter is someone's child, someone's loved one." Claire wrapped an arm around her daughter. "You've helped create the change you wanted to see." "No," Sarah corrected her, "we all did. One choice at a time, one person at a time, one day at a time." The Washington Monument glowed in the distance, a reminder of how far their local story had reached. But for Sarah, the real victory wasn't in the national attention or policy changes. It was in the simple fact that somewhere, right now, another young person was walking home safely, protected by officers who had learned to see the humanity in every face they encountered. The story hadn't ended. It had multiplied, spreading hope and change across the country, one department, one community, one heart at a time.